The cantina on Kepler's Rest was always busy. But tonight felt different. Young alien soldiers from across the galaxy had gathered around a single table in the darkest corner. They whispered among themselves, pointing at the scarred figure sitting alone with his drink. Commander HFY looked nothing like the proud Catherian warrior he once was. Where his natural arms should have been, metal replacements gleamed under the dim lights. His once perfect blue skin was marked with deep scars that would never heal. The cybernetic implant over his left eye glowed softly as he stared into his glass. The young soldiers had been asking him for months to tell his story. Tonight, something in his tired expression told them he was finally ready. "Commander," said Lieutenant Sira, a young Villani with bright green scales. "Please, we need to know what really happened during the human war." HFY looked up slowly. His good eye focused on the eager faces around him. These children had only heard rumors and official reports. They had no idea what humans were truly capable of. "You think you want to know?" he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. "But once I tell you, you will never sleep peacefully again." The young aliens leaned forward. They had heard this warning before, but their curiosity was stronger than their fear. HFY took a long drink and set down his glass. "Very well. But remember, you asked for this." He began his tale in the way all military reports started, with facts and numbers. But even those simple facts carried a chill that made the listeners uncomfortable. 37 years ago, the Galactic Consortium discovered a new species. They called themselves humans. They lived on the third planet of a small star system they named Sol. Our scientists studied them from a distance for 2 years. The commander's metal fingers drummed against the table. The reports said they were primitive. They had only achieved faster than light travel 50 years earlier. Their technology was crude compared to ours. They fought among themselves constantly. Their planet was divided into hundreds of separate nations that could not agree on anything. A young Thraxian officer raised his hand. "Why did the consortium decide to make contact? They usually wait longer before approaching new species." HFY's laugh was bitter. "Greed. The human star system was rich in rare minerals. Their planet had resources we needed. The Consortium Council decided that humans were too primitive to resist. They would be easy to control." The cantina seemed to grow quieter around them. Even the background noise of other conversations faded, as nearby aliens unconsciously leaned in to listen. "The plan was simple," HFY continued. "We would arrive with overwhelming force. The humans would see our superior technology and surrender. Then we would establish a protectorate government. The humans would mine their planets for us in exchange for advanced technology and membership in the consortium." "It sounds reasonable," Lieutenant Zira said carefully. "That is what we all thought." The commander's eye implant flickered brighter. "We were assigned to pacify what the briefings called a minor species with limited military capacity. My people, the Catherians, were chosen to lead the operation because of our reputation for clean, efficient warfare." The young soldiers knew the Catherian reputation well. They were legendary for their precise military tactics and logical approach to conflict. If any species could handle a simple pacification mission, it would be them. "The consortium assembled a fleet of 300 ships," HFY said. "It was the largest force ever used against such a small target. We had soldiers from 27 different species. Our technology was centuries ahead of anything the humans possessed." He paused to take another drink. The young aliens waited patiently, sensing that the real story was about to begin. "I commanded the dreadnought Eternal Logic. My crew was hand-picked from the finest Catherian military academies. We had fought in 12 previous campaigns, without a single major loss. We expected this mission to be routine." "What happened?" asked a quiet voice from the back of the group. HFY's scarred face grew darker. "We learned that humans do not think the way other species think. Our intelligence reports were accurate about their technology and their divided governments. But they missed something crucial." The commander leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The young soldiers had to strain to hear him. "Humans are not like us. When most species face a superior force, they calculate the odds. They weigh the costs and benefits. They make logical decisions based on survival probability. We expected them to do the same. But they didn't, Lieutenant Sierra asked. No. The word came out like a curse. They did something that no consortium analyst had ever considered. Something that violated every principle of civilized warfare we understood. The silence stretched until one of the young soldiers could not stand it anymore. What did they do? HFY's metal hand clenched around his glass. They fought back, not with logic or calculation or careful strategy. They fought with something we had never encountered before. He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. They fought with pure, desperate, illogical fury. And they fought like they enjoyed it. The commander stood up slowly, his cybernetic legs whirring softly. We arrived at their colony world of New Geneva, expecting a quick surrender. Instead, we found ourselves facing an enemy that would rather die than submit. An enemy that had already prepared for our arrival in ways we could never have imagined. He walked away from the table, leaving the young soldiers sitting in stunned silence. Just before he reached the cantina exit, he turned back. That was when I learned the first rule about fighting humans, he said. Never assume they will act logically. They are capable of choices that will terrify you in ways you cannot imagine. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving the young aliens alone with their thoughts and their growing dread about what they would hear tomorrow. Outside, station lights twinkled like stars in the darkness. Somewhere far away, human ships moved between those same stars, carrying the descendants of the species that had changed everything about how the galaxy understood war. And in the quiet of his quarters, Commander HFY tried once again to sleep without dreaming of screaming human voices echoing across the void. The next evening, the young alien officers gathered again. Commander HFY was already waiting at the same table, staring at his drink. His metal fingers traced patterns on the surface as if trying to erase memories that would never fade. "You came back," he said without looking up. "We need to understand," Lieutenant Sierra replied firmly. "What happened at New Geneva?" HFY's cybernetic eye flickered. New Geneva was a human colony world with about 2 million inhabitants. Our intelligence said it had minimal defensive capabilities, a few orbital platforms and maybe a dozen patrol ships. He took a slow breath before continuing. The consortium fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. Standard formation. 300 ships arranged in perfect battle lines. We began broadcasting surrender demands in 47 different languages. A young Thraxian leaned forward. "Did they respond?" "Oh," they responded. The commander's laugh was hollow. "But not the way we expected. Instead of opening communication channels, they started moving." HFY stood and walked to the cantina's large window. Beyond the thick glass, stars twinkled in the endless dark. Somewhere out there, human ships still sailed between those same stars. 37 human vessels came to meet us. They were exactly what our intelligence reports had described. Old designs, mismatched hulls, clearly inferior technology. My tactical computer calculated a 96% probability of human surrender within the first hour. He turned back to face the young aliens. The humans formed up in what looked like a defensive position near their outer planet. We moved forward slowly, giving them time to see our overwhelming numbers. The plan was to demonstrate our superior firepower and accept their surrender. But they didn't surrender, Lieutenant Sierra said quietly. No, they did something else entirely. HFY's good eye grew distant. When we reached weapons range, they opened fire immediately. No negotiations, no attempts to bargain. They just started shooting. The commander sat back down heavily. At first, we thought it was foolish desperation. 37 ships against 300. Their weapons could barely scratch our shields. My weapons officer was laughing about it. He paused, and the young soldiers could see his hands trembling slightly. Then they did something that changed everything. The first human ship to take critical damage turned directly toward us. Full speed. No attempt to retreat or repair systems. The crew was broadcasting something our translators couldn't understand at first. "What were they broadcasting?" asked a young Villani engineer. "Songs," HFY whispered. They were singing battle songs, farewell songs, songs about their homes and families. And underneath the music, they kept repeating the same phrase over and over. The aliens waited in tense silence. For Earth. For the children. The commander's voice cracked slightly. That ship, the UES Defiant, rammed straight into the heavy cruiser. Geometric perfection. Both ships were destroyed instantly. 3,000 Cytherian souls lost in a single moment because one human captain chose to die rather than retreat. The young soldiers exchanged shocked glances. Ramming attacks were considered barbaric by every civilized species. They violated every principle of honorable warfare. That was just the beginning, HFY continued. 3 more human ships followed the first one. Each time a vessel took heavy damage, instead of surrendering or withdrawing, they would accelerate toward the nearest consortium ship. His metal hand clenched into a fist. We had no tactical response for this behavior. Our computers couldn't calculate proper defensive positions because the humans weren't acting logically. They were turning their own destruction into a weapon. A young Altarian officer raised a tentative hand. Surely their fleet command ordered them to stop such wasteful tactics? HFY's bitter laugh filled the cantina. That was when we learned another truth about humans. They don't have fleet command the way we do. Each ship captain was making independent decisions, and every single one of them chose to fight like their dying ship was their final gift to the war effort. He stood again and began pacing around the table. After the 4th ramming attack, Admiral Kethvar ordered the fleet to spread formation and prepare for what he called aberrant suicide tactics. We thought we were dealing with a species driven mad by fear. But that wasn't it, was it? Lieutenant Sierra asked. No. Fear had nothing to do with it. The commander stopped pacing and faced them directly. We intercepted their communications. The human captains were discussing their attacks with the same calm professionalism we used for routine maneuvers. They were calculating optimal impact angles and sharing targeting data. The young aliens sat in horrified silence as the implications sank in. They had weaponized their own deaths. But worse than that, they were learning from each attack. The 5th ramming run took out 2 of our ships because the humans had analyzed our defensive patterns. HFY returned to his seat and took a long drink. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, we had lost 23 ships and over 40,000 crew members. The humans lost all 37 of their vessels. That sounds like a consortium victory, a young Thraxian said hopefully. Does it? The commander's cybernetic eye fixed on him. We lost 23 advanced warships to destroy 37 primitive vessels. At that exchange rate, the humans could afford to fight us ship for ship across the entire galaxy. He leaned back in his chair. But the real horror came after the battle ended. We detected encrypted transmissions broadcasting from the planet below. Not surrender offers or peace negotiations. What were they transmitting? Evacuation orders. The humans were already abandoning New Geneva. They had recorded every moment of the battle and were sending the tactical data to other human colonies. HFY's voice grew quieter. They were treating their defeat as a learning experience. The young soldiers struggled to understand the concept. Most species would negotiate after such a devastating loss. Within days, we learned that humans were evacuating 17 colonies along our planned advance route. They weren't just retreating. They were destroying everything useful before they left. Mining equipment, orbital stations, even the spaceports. They were denying you resources, Lieutenant Zero realized. Worse, they were preparing for a longer war. A war where they could afford to lose battles as long as they learned something from each defeat. The commander's shoulders sagged. That was when I first understood that we weren't fighting a normal species. He looked around the table at the young faces watching him. Humans don't fight to win battles. They fight to win wars, and they're willing to lose everything in individual engagements if it serves their larger strategic goals. What did the consortium command decide to do? HFY finished his drink and prepared to leave. They decided that the humans needed to be taught a proper lesson about the futility of resistance. The next phase would target the human home system directly. He walked toward the exit, then paused at the door. That was when we learned that everything we thought we knew about human warfare was wrong. New Geneva was not their desperate last stand. It was their opening move. The door closed behind him, leaving the young aliens alone with the terrible realization that they had only heard the beginning of a story that would get much worse. Outside, in the cold silence of space, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the nightmares that played out among them. Commander HFY was already waiting when the young officers arrived for the third night. His drink sat untouched on the table, and his cybernetic eye stared blankly at the wall. The scars on his blue skin seemed deeper under the cantina's dim lighting. 6 months after New Geneva, he began without preamble. The Consortium High Command decided to end the human problem once and for all. Lieutenant Sierra settled into her seat carefully. They decided to attack Earth directly? Yes. Operation Final Logic. The commander's metal fingers drummed against the table. 800 ships, the largest military force the consortium had ever assembled. Representatives from 43 species, including the finest fleets from the core worlds. A young Altarian engineer leaned forward. Surely that was enough to overwhelm any human defenses? HFY's bitter smile sent chills through the group. That's what we thought. Our intelligence reports showed that the Sol system had fewer than 200 human vessels of military grade. Most of their fleet was spread across their colonies, fighting delaying actions against our advance forces. He picked up his drink but didn't take a sip. I was promoted to lead the second wave aboard the dreadnought Inevitable Conclusion. The plan was simple. Arrive in overwhelming force, demonstrate our superiority, and accept Earth's surrender within 48 hours. What went wrong? Asked a quiet Thraxian voice. Everything. The word fell like a stone into still water. We dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, expecting to find a demoralized enemy preparing to surrender. Instead, we found something that defied every principle of civilized warfare. HFY stood and walked to the window again. The stars beyond seemed to mock him with their peaceful twinkling. The humans had turned their entire star system into a weapon. Not just their military ships or their orbital platforms. Everything. Every asteroid, every moon, every piece of space debris had been repositioned and weaponized. The young aliens exchanged bewildered glances. The asteroid belt between their fourth and fifth planets had been completely reorganized. What should have been random chunks of rock floating in predictable orbits had become a vast maze of gravitational traps and kinetic projectiles. He turned back to face them. Our fleet moved into the system in standard formation. Within an hour, we realized we were flying into the largest minefield in galactic history. But these weren't normal mines. What were they? Lieutenant Zira asked. Asteroids. Hundreds of them. Accelerated to incredible velocities and aimed along our most likely approach vectors. The humans had spent months calculating our probable tactics and preparing accordingly. The commander sat back down heavily. But that was just the beginning. As we tried to navigate through the asteroid maze, civilian ships began appearing from hiding places throughout the system. Civilian ships? Cargo haulers, passenger liners, mining vessels, even school ships from their orbital academies. All of them had been converted into makeshift warships. HFY's voice grew quieter. End of sea, sense people. The humans had militarized their entire civilian population. A young Villani officer shook her head in confusion. But civilians aren't trained for military operations. They would be useless in combat. That's what we thought too. The commander's eye implant flickered brighter. We were wrong. These weren't panicked civilians trying to defend their homes. They were organized, disciplined, and completely committed to destroying us. He took a shaky sip of his drink. A human cargo ship called the Lucky Strike emerged from behind one of Jupiter's moons. Our sensors showed it was carrying standard shipping containers. When it opened fire, those containers split apart to reveal fusion warheads powerful enough to crack a moon. The young soldiers listened in stunned silence. The ship's captain was broadcasting on an open channel. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old, but she was coordinating attack runs with the precision of a veteran admiral. Her crew was singing again. always singing. What were they singing about this time? Asked the Thraxian. Their children. Their families back on Earth. Their hope that their sacrifice would buy time for others to escape. HFY's metal hand trembled. They were treating their own deaths like gifts they were giving to people they loved. He stood again and began pacing. But the worst was yet to come. As we pushed deeper into the system, more ships kept appearing. Vessels that should have been civilian were revealing themselves as heavily armed combat platforms. How was that possible? The humans had done something unthinkable. They had turned every aspect of their society into a potential military asset. Hospitals became forward medical stations. Schools became training centers and communication hubs. Even their children were calculating firing solutions and relaying tactical data. The commander stopped pacing and stared directly at Lieutenant Sierra. Do you understand what that means? In 6 months, an entire species had transformed itself into a military force. Not just their armies or their fleets, but their whole civilization. A chill ran through the gathered aliens as the implications became clear. We intercepted communications from one of their orbital academies. Children between the ages of 12 and 16 were running sensor analysis for their defense fleet. They were processing targeting data with mathematical precision that impressed even our Kytherian computers. That's impossible, protested a young Altarian. Children can't function in military operations. Human children can. The words carried absolute certainty. We captured some of their communications. A 14-year-old girl named Sarah was coordinating asteroid impacts, while her younger brother tracked our fleet movements. They were treating it like an educational exercise. HFY returned to his seat and looked around the table. That was when I realized we weren't fighting a normal war. We were fighting an entire species that had decided to become dangerous. What do you mean? Lieutenant Sierra asked quietly. Most species have soldiers and civilians. Combatants and non-combatants. The humans had erased that distinction completely. Every person in their system was a potential threat. Every ship could be carrying weapons. Every asteroid might be aimed at your hull. The commander's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But the most terrifying part was their coordination. 8 billion people, all working together with perfect unity. No arguments, no hesitation, no second-guessing their leaders. How is that possible for such a divided species? Because they weren't fighting for their governments or their nations anymore. They were fighting for their species' survival. And when humans fight for survival, they become something else entirely. HFY finished his drink and prepared to leave. The battle for Sol lasted 3 weeks. We lost over 400 ships before Admiral Kethvar ordered a tactical withdrawal. 400 ships destroyed by an enemy that wasn't supposed to have any significant military capability. He walked toward the exit, then turned back one final time. But losing those ships wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what the humans taught us about ourselves. What do you mean? We learned that everything we thought we knew about warfare was wrong. We learned that numerical superiority means nothing against an enemy that refuses to acknowledge defeat. And we learned that humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy precisely because they don't think like we do. The door closed behind him, leaving the young aliens alone with the growing realization that they were hearing about something far worse than a simple military defeat. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the fears of those who sailed between them. On the 4th night, Commander HFY appeared different. His usual exhaustion had been replaced by something worse. A haunted awareness that seemed to look right through the young aliens gathered around him. Tonight I will tell you the deepest truth about humans, he said before anyone could ask. Tonight you will understand why the war really ended the way it did. Lieutenant Sierra noticed that his metal hands were shaking slightly. Commander, what did you discover? After the disaster at Sol, the Consortium Science Division began emergency studies of human biology and psychology. They needed to understand what made these creatures so effective in combat. His cybernetic eye dimmed as if he was trying to forget what he had learned. What did they find? HFY took a long drink before answering. They found out that humans are not like other intelligent species. Most of us evolved from prey animals or peaceful omnivores. Our ancestors survived by being clever, cooperative, or by finding safe places to hide. He stood and walked to the window, pressing his metal palm against the cool glass. Humans evolved differently. They descended from persistence hunters, predators that would chase their prey for days until it collapsed from exhaustion. A young Thraxian engineer looked confused. But humans aren't physically impressive. They're smaller and weaker than most species. That's what we thought too. The commander's reflection in the window looked like a ghost. But physical strength isn't what makes humans dangerous. It's their minds. Dang you. He turned back to face the group. A human brain is designed to function under extreme stress for extended periods. While most species shut down when faced with overwhelming odds, humans become more focused. They think more clearly when they're dying. That doesn't make sense, protested a young Villani officer. Doesn't it? Zephy's smile was terrible. During the Soul Battle, we captured several human soldiers. Our medical teams expected them to be traumatized and broken. Instead, we found something that violated everything we knew about biology. He sat back down and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The humans we captured had injuries that should have killed them hours earlier. Broken bones, internal bleeding, massive trauma. But they were still alert, still planning escapes, still trying to gather intelligence about our ships. The young aliens shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One human soldier, a female named Martinez, had taken plasma fire across her entire left side. Half her body was burned beyond repair. Our medical experts said she should have been unconscious from pain and blood loss. But she wasn't? No. She was wide awake and asking our doctors technical questions about Catherian anatomy. She wanted to know our weak points in case she got a chance to kill someone before she died. A shocked silence filled the cantina. The medical team ran tests on all our human prisoners. They discovered that the human nervous system has something called an adrenaline response that actually improves their combat effectiveness under stress. Fear and pain make them stronger, not weaker. Zephai's metal fingers drummed against the table. But that wasn't even the worst discovery. The worst was when our psychologists studied human emotional responses to combat. What did they find? They found that humans experience terror just like we do. But unlike every other species in the galaxy, humans can function normally while being absolutely terrified. They can make complex tactical decisions while their bodies are flooded with panic hormones. Lieutenant Zira leaned forward. How is that possible? Evolution. For millions of years, humans survived by being afraid of the right things at the right times. But they also had to keep hunting while they were afraid. So their minds learned to separate fear from action. The commander stood again and began pacing around the table. During one interrogation, a human pilot named Chen described a battle where his ship was completely disabled. He was trapped in a burning cockpit, watching his squadron get destroyed around him. He said he was more scared than he had ever been in his life. What did he do? He manually calculated firing solutions for the remaining weapons and took out 3 of our fighters before his ship exploded. He did advanced mathematics while believing he was about to die in agony. The young aliens exchanged horrified glances. But the psychological reports revealed something even more disturbing. Humans don't just function through fear. They use it as fuel. The more desperate their situation becomes, the more creative and dangerous they become. Zephy stopped pacing and fixed his gaze on each alien in turn. We intercepted communications from a human medical ship that had been cornered by one of our cruiser squadrons. The ship had no weapons and was carrying wounded civilians. What happened? The human medical officer, a doctor named Williams, somehow converted their surgical equipment into improvised weapons. Using nothing but medical supplies, she created explosive devices powerful enough to damage military-grade armor. The commander's voice grew quieter. But here's what made it truly terrifying. While she was building weapons from bandages and medical scanners, she was simultaneously performing surgery on wounded children. Her hands were steady enough for brain surgery while she planned ways to kill our soldiers. That's impossible, whispered a young Altarian. Is it? Human combat medics routinely treat injuries while under enemy fire. They perform surgery in conditions that would paralyze most species with terror. They save lives, and take lives with equal skill, often within minutes of each other. HFY returned to his seat and stared at his drink. The science reports concluded that humans are uniquely adapted for what they call total war. They can transform any situation into a combat opportunity. They can turn medical supplies into weapons, civilian ships into warships, even children into tactical assets. You mentioned that before. How can children be tactical assets? Human children develop problem-solving abilities through play. They learn to think strategically by competing in games and sports. By the time they reach adolescence, many of them can process complex tactical scenarios, as well as trained military officers from other species. The commander's cybernetic eye flickered brighter. We found communications from human families where parents were teaching their children to calculate orbital mechanics for asteroid impacts. A 10-year-old boy was helping his mother plan evacuation routes for their colony by solving mathematical equations that challenged our computers. They were using their own children as weapons? No. That's what we didn't understand. They weren't using their children as anything. The children were volunteering. Human young actively seek ways to contribute to their family's survival. They want to be useful in crisis situations. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The final psychological report contained one conclusion that changed everything about how the consortium viewed this war. HFY looked directly at Lieutenant Sierra. Humans don't fight wars the way we do. We fight until the cost becomes too high. Then we negotiate. Humans fight until they win or until they're extinct. There is no middle ground. He finished his drink and prepared to leave. That medical ship I mentioned? Dr. Williams? She successfully defended her hospital ship against an entire cruiser squadron. When we finally captured her, she was still trying to bite through the restraints to get at our soldiers. What happened to her? She was released in a prisoner exchange 3 months later. Our intelligence reports say she's now training other human doctors in emergency combat medicine. She's teaching them to fight wars using medical equipment. 1. The commander walked toward the exit, then paused. Tomorrow, I will tell you how this knowledge changed the war. How understanding human nature made the consortium realize something that terrified every species in the galaxy. The door closed behind him, leaving the young aliens alone with the growing certainty that humans represented something fundamentally different from every other form of intelligent life they had ever encountered. Outside, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the nightmares that played out in the darkness between them. On the 5th and final night, Commander HFY looked older than his years. The weight of his memories seemed to have aged him decades in the past week. When the young aliens arrived, he was already sitting at their usual table, staring at a photograph in his metal hand. "What is that?" Lieutenant Sierra asked gently. "A picture from before the war." His voice was barely audible. "My unit after our victory at the Proxima Rebellion. We thought we were the finest soldiers in the galaxy." He set the photograph down carefully. "We had no idea what real soldiers looked like." The young officers settled into their seats quietly, sensing that tonight would be different. 18 months, HFY said suddenly. That's how long the human war lasted, from first contact to final ceasefire. 18 months to change everything about how warfare is understood in this galaxy. "You said the consortium had overwhelming advantages," said a young Thraxian. "Superior technology, more ships, alliance with dozens of species. What changed?" The commander's cybernetic eye focused on something far beyond the cantina walls. "We began to realize that we weren't winning. We were losing ships, losing battles, and worst of all, we were creating something far more dangerous than the enemy we started fighting." "What do you mean?" "Every battle taught the humans something new about fighting us. But it was worse than simple learning. They were adapting their entire species to be better at killing aliens." His metal fingers traced patterns on the table. "After 6 months of warfare, human tactics had evolved beyond anything our strategists could predict." Lieutenant Sierra leaned forward. "How so?" "At the beginning, humans fought like humans. They used human weapons, human ships, human tactics. But as the war continued, they started thinking like something else entirely." HFY stood and walked to the window. "We intercepted a communication from a human commander named Thompson. She was explaining to her crew why they needed to modify their weapon systems. She said they had learned that Catherian armor was vulnerable to specific frequencies of plasma fire. That's normal military adaptation, is it? The commander turned back to them. She had figured this out by studying the bodies of dead Catherian soldiers. She cut them apart to understand our weak points. Then she shared this information with every human unit in her sector. The young aliens shifted uncomfortably, but here's what made it truly terrifying. 6 weeks later, every human ship in the war zone had modified their weapons to exploit Catherian vulnerabilities. Not just Thompson's unit. Every single human force had adopted her discoveries and improved on them. How is that possible? Human military doctrine is based on something they call distributed learning. Every unit shares tactical knowledge with every other unit instantly. When one human discovers an effective technique, the entire species knows about it within days. HFY returned to his seat and picked up the photograph again. By month 9 of the war, we realized that humans were no longer fighting the same way they had fought at New Geneva. They had become something new. What had they become? Anti-alien specialists. Their entire military had evolved specifically to counter consortium tactics and technology. They knew our weaknesses better than we did. They could predict our strategies before we implemented them. The commander's voice grew quieter. We captured a human intelligence officer named Park. Under interrogation, she demonstrated knowledge of Catherian military doctrine that impressed our own generals. She could recite our battle formations, predict our tactical responses, even explain the psychological profiles of individual consortium commanders. How could she know so much? Because humans are natural hunters, and they had made us their prey. Every piece of information about alien species had become a tactical advantage. Every weakness, every cultural limitation, every predictable behavior pattern. HFY set down the photograph and looked around the table. Park told our interrogators something that changed how High Command viewed the entire war. She said that fighting us was making humans stronger. What did she mean? Before the war, humans were divided into hundreds of competing nations and factions. The war forced them to unite completely for the first time in their history. 8 billion individuals suddenly working toward a single goal. The commander's cybernetic eye flickered brighter. But it was worse than unity. The war was selecting for the most dangerous human traits. The survivors were the ones who could think tactically under pressure, who could innovate weapons from nothing, who could function through pain and terror. Natural selection, whispered a young Volani engineer. Exactly. We were accidentally breeding a more dangerous version of humanity. Every battle eliminated the humans, who couldn't adapt to alien warfare. Every engagement left behind survivors who were better at fighting us. HFY stood and began pacing around the table. The final intelligence report that ended the war contained a projection that terrified every species in the consortium. If the conflict continued for another 10 years, humans would become the most effective military force in galactic history. But they were still outnumbered. Numbers stopped mattering. By month 15, individual human units were consistently defeating consortium forces 3 times their size. Human captains were outmaneuvering our best admirals. Human engineers were building weapons more effective than anything in our arsenals. The commander stopped pacing and faced them directly. The war ended because we realized we were creating our own perfect enemy. Every day the conflict continued. Humans became more dangerous to every other species in the galaxy. So the consortium surrendered? Not surrendered. Withdrew. There's a difference. HFY's expression grew grim. The official ceasefire agreement established human space as an exclusion zone. No alien vessels are permitted within 50 light-years of any human colony without explicit permission. That sounds like the humans won. They did more than win. They proved that they're the most dangerous species in known space. The commander returned to his seat and picked up his drink with a shaking hand. But the worst part isn't what they did during the war. It's what they're doing now. What do you mean? The humans who fought us are now reaching positions of leadership in their society. Military officers are becoming politicians, scientists, engineers. The knowledge they gained fighting aliens is being integrated into their entire civilization. HFY's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Park, that intelligence officer I mentioned? She's now director of human colonial expansion. Thompson, the commander who learned to dissect Catherian armor? She's designing ships for human exploration fleets. The implications hit the young aliens like a physical blow. Every human who survived the war learned something about fighting aliens. Now they're teaching those skills to their children, building them into their technology, incorporating them into their culture. The commander finished his drink and prepared to leave for the last time. The war ended 37 years ago. But we didn't defeat the humans. We educated them. We taught an entire species how to be dangerous to us. He walked toward the exit, then paused at the door. Today, there are over 15 billion humans spread across hundreds of worlds. They're expanding faster than any species in galactic history, and every one of them grows up learning the lessons their parents learned fighting us. What does that mean for the galaxy? HFY's final words echoed through the suddenly quiet cantina. It means that someday, when humans decide they want something from another species, they'll take it, and there won't be anything anyone can do to stop them. The door closed behind him, leaving the young aliens alone with the terrible knowledge of what their predecessors had unleashed upon the galaxy. Outside, human ships moved between the stars, carrying the children of warriors who had learned to turn fear into fury, defeat into victory, and war itself into evolution. And in the dark between the stars, other species watched those human ships and remembered Commander HFY's warning. Never assume they will act logically. They are capable of choices that will terrify you in ways you cannot imagine. The age of human expansion had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.